Hey guys, now that Survivor 44 is wrapped up, it is now time to do my player ranking, where I rank all 18 players based on the games that they played during the season. And there were definitely some hard selections here, definitely with certain players being relatively close, but we'll get into those more in a moment. But there are 18 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 18, and just like Big Brother Canada, we have someone that's here pretty much by default, but here we have Bruce, the first person to leave the game, and obviously I feel bad for Bruce. I mean, concussions aren't fun, and to see him being the first player to ever leave the game on the first night is pretty disheartening if you ask me. However, just like Amal, we don't really see much of him on the show. He only gets that one confessional, and then all of his content thereafter is about his injury. Now, if I had to suspect, he was probably close with the Carolyn and Yam Yam side of things, and there's a good chance that had he stuck around that he could have been in a solid alliance with those three. Now, how well he would have done individually in the game, I'm not too sure. I know I wasn't too high on him in the preseason, where I felt like he didn't really have much of an arc to actually win the game, but I do feel like he would have made it at least a couple rounds into the game for sure. And I think it'll be even more interesting to see how he does on Survivor 45, where we will really get to see like what he's made of. So for all I know, he could be the greatest player of all time, but on this season at least, we didn't really see much of him. So because of that, he is here number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and I feel like these next two were pretty close in my estimation, as I feel like they're both players that were taken at their first opportunity and weren't the best positioned in the game. However, at number 17, I did decide to go with Claire. And the reason I went with Claire is that I feel like Claire had less solid allies on her tribe, where she does talk in her exit interview about how she tried to build bonds with pretty much everyone, tried to make herself the middle, and particularly focused on her relationship with Franny and Matt, where while on the show at least she was shown to be against the showmans, in reality, she was actually trying to work with them and really trying to play the middle. However, she wasn't really well positioned on her tribe. I feel like she largely overestimated her position on the tribe. She obviously sat out of all three of the immunity challenges that her tribe was in, which made her come off as weaker compared to the other players. And through that, she is voted out unanimously after she plays her shot in the dark. So none of that's particularly great. However, I will give her a couple things. One is that I do think she was voted out more for being seen as a challenge weakness, where I feel like between her and Josh, while Josh was probably worse socially than she was, I feel like people kept around Josh because he was better physically in the challenges, whereas Claire was seen as a weakness due to her sitting out of all three immunity challenges. So I think that's something to consider. And I think the other thing is that at least by the end, she recognized that she was in danger to the point where she does play her shot in the dark. And obviously that's unsuccessful, but I do think that shows that at least by the end, she was a little bit aware about her position in the game. So at the end of the day, I don't think Claire's the worst player in the world, and I don't think her game is the worst either. But I feel like compared to all the others, I feel like she played the worst game of the players that have been voted out, which is why she is here number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have another player pretty similar to Claire, but here we have Helen. And I think Helen and Claire are around the same level in my eyes. I feel like both of them were taken at the first opportunity and weren't necessarily the best position in the world. However, the reason I went with Helen above Claire is that I think Helen had a more solid alliance at one point than Claire, where I feel like Helen, at least at one point, had both Sarah and Carson on their side. And yes, while Carson was very clearly playing the middle, I feel like Sarah was definitely on her side. And I actually think Helen gets a bit unlucky that Sarah lost her vote at that first tribal after going to the summit. Whereas I feel like had that not happened, it would have been sort of like 2-2 with Carson in the middle. But I feel like with Sarah losing her vote, plus Carson thinking that Helen had an idol, that sort of incentivized Carson to flip over to the Yam Yam and Carolyn side to take out Helen there. So I actually think Helen gets a bit unlucky that Sarah lost her vote there that incentivized Carson to flip against them. And it is a knock that Carson thought that she had an idol to where he didn't really trust her. But I feel like compared to Claire, I feel like the fact that Helen at least had more solid alliances was enough to have her at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and I didn't really know what to do with this person, as I actually have more complaints with this person's game than Helen or Claire, but they do have one major upside that puts them above them. But we actually have the first boot of the season, and here we have Maddy. Now, at the end of the day, I feel like Maddy played pretty much how I expected her to, and even if she had survived that first round, I don't know how well she would have done moving forward. However, the biggest pro to her game is the fact that she actually got the numbers on her side during that first vote, where she did get the numbers against Brandon to send him home, except for the fact that Brandon had an idol there. So that makes her the first boot to ever be idled out of the game, which I think says something about her gameplay during that one round. Now, obviously, I have issues with her game, where first up, she decides to target Brandon, someone that very publicly has an idol, which is a very risky move to be making during the first round, and especially with all the shenanigans happening with Jaime being paranoid and using her shot in the dark. You have Matthew again using her shot in the dark there. You have Lauren going to the summit in a position where she could have lost her vote, and obviously she doesn't vote due to her advantage. Like, Maddy takes a big swing here for seemingly no reason, where I feel like she could have gotten away with shifting the target towards a smaller threat, and like make Brandon potentially flush his idol, or at least secure the votes enough to at least split the vote. I feel like she took an unnecessary risk by targeting Brandon in the first place, even knowing that he had an idol. You obviously have the fact that she doesn't make Jaime feel comfortable enough to not use Shot in the Dark, where yes, Jaime was the target at one point, but the fact that Maddy doesn't lock her up solidly enough to actually vote for her is a knock there. And I actually don't fault her as much for not getting Matthew or Lauren on their side, as it sort of made sense for them to not vote there, with Matthew wanting to hide his allegiance and Lauren wanting to get that extra vote for a future round. I don't blame her that much for there, but at the end of the day, I still feel like Maddy could have done things better. But the main reason I have her above Helen and Claire is the fact that she shouldn't have been the first boot. She did manage to get the numbers on her side to take out Brandon, and if Brandon hadn't had an idol, she would have gotten her way there. But obviously, she decided to do so even knowing that Brandon had an idol, and when he predictably played the idol, she was pretty much a goner at that point. But the fact that she at least had the numbers on her side for that first round is enough to have her above Helen and Claire in my eyes, so because of that, she is here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we're actually jumping forward a little bit in the boot order here, but we actually have the merge boot of the season, and here we have Josh. And the fact that Josh made it to the merge, or mergatory I guess, is a bit insane considering the path he took to get there, where despite his placement, he actually played a pretty mediocre game, all things considered. Where early on, he is obviously on Sokka, however, he's not really insulated with Sokka at all, where we definitely heard from people like Claire talking about how they wanted to work with Josh, but they were just sort of turned off by him, given that he came off as a bit sketchy. He wasn't particularly that great socially, which resulted in him not having many alliances. And really the main reason that he survives like that Claire round is because he's seen as better in challenges than Claire. But then we get to the swap where we see him thinking that he was in this great position on Sokka, that he was pretty much in the middle of everything, when in reality he would have been the next boot had they ever gone back to tribals. So even then he was pretty unaware about his game, and while he technically gets swap screwed by getting sent to Tika, considering that he wasn't even in a good position on Sokka to begin with, I mean, he pretty much just went from the bottom of one tribe to the bottom of the other tribe. Now he is handed an idol, so he's pretty much safe during that first round, and while I could give him a bit of credit for flipping Carolyn against Sarah, I feel like it was simply in Carolyn's best interest to flip at that point, as by getting rid of Sarah there, she would have been the swing vote if they ever went back to tribal. Now, what I will give Josh a bit more credit for is kind of stealing that swing vote position away from Carolyn, to where he is able to sort of build this bond with Yam Yam, which makes it so that he sort of becomes a swing vote if they go at the tribal with Yam Yam and Carolyn against each other. But after Carolyn and Yam Yam reconcile, he's pretty much screwed at that point, except for the fact that that tribal gets canceled after Matthew quits the game. So really, that's another case of Josh being saved here. And then at the merge, he's pretty much just a consensus target where he doesn't really have anyone in his corner. And yes, while the vote is a bit scattered, I feel like a lot of that was to avoid an idle play. I feel like very little of it stemmed from people wanting to keep Josh around. So at the end of the day, I think Josh actually played a pretty mediocre game where he was pretty much on the bottom for most of the game, despite him thinking that he was in this great position on his initial tribe. He gets pretty lucky at certain points, particularly with that idol he was handed at the swap, and even then I don't think he was able to fully take advantage of it by the time of that last level before the merge, and the fact that he even is the merge boot despite the fact that they lost that last immunity challenge also stems from luck given that Matthew left the game. So at the end of the day, I feel like Josh's game was pretty bad. So because of that, he is here number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we're going back to the pre-merge. And I kind of hate to put this person a bit lower, but considering their game, I can't put them too much higher. But here we have Sarah. And I think Sarah gets kind of unlucky over the course of this season, where obviously she is pretty much on the bottom for a lot of her run, where early on she was seen as part of that alliance with her, Helen, and Carson, but then she gets sent to Sheeple Island where she loses her vote in order to get an advantage at the next round. However, through her not being able to vote, I feel like that sort of incentivizes Carson to flip against her and Helen at the first tribal, causing her to lose Helen in a pretty dramatic fashion there. And afterwards, I feel like she is largely on the bottom, where, I mean, there is a chance that Carson could have flipped back at that point to maybe continue to play the middle. But I feel like there's still a very strong chance that she could have been voted out had they gone back to tribal, which then leads into the swap where obviously Carson gets swapped up for Josh, who did appear to be a pretty consensus target, except that Josh was pretty much handed an idol that pretty much forced Carolyn to flip at that point to cause Sarah to be voted out there. So I think Sarah gets pretty unlucky over the course of her run, and not to mention the fact that she finds the idol thinking that it's real only for it to actually be fake, which is a bit unfortunate there. So at the end of the day, I feel like Sarah's game is her largely in the bottom, but not so much due to things in her control. Like, yeah, it's not great that she wasn't able to keep Carson on her side. However, I feel like by her not having a vote, it just gave Carson less incentive to vote in that side of things. And then moving forward, the fact that Josh was handed an idol that gave him safety during that first round was another source of her getting unlucky. So I actually think Sarah got a bit unlucky at the end of the day, and I guess you could fault her a bit for not playing her advantage at that tribal, but still, I feel like all those things add up to her being a bit better than the players we already talked about, given how many things were out of her control. I feel like number 13 is a good spot to put her. Now moving on to number 12, and we have a player that I'm a little surprised is as low as they are, but when you really look at their game, it kind of makes sense. But here we have Brandon. And obviously there's a number of things with Brandon, namely the fact that despite him being the second juror, he never survives a single round of gameplay without some sort of immunity, which by itself isn't that bad, but when you really look at his position throughout a lot of the game, it's not that great. Where first up, at the first tribal, he needs an idol to save himself. That's not great. He would have gotten the most votes at that tribal, and yes, while Shot in the Darks and Lauren's Advantage played a factor, he still got the most votes there, so him needing an idol right out the bat isn't that great. But even afterwards, yes, he does win his way to the merge, and he does build a very solid alliance with Lauren, who through their extra vote, they secure 3 of the 6 votes there, but obviously that just wasn't enough, especially after the other side and Matthew and Kane are able to pick up Jaime and then Carson after the swap. It made it so that if they ever did go back to tribal, his side would have been in the minority there, where they could have easily just stacked their votes onto Lauren, causing a tie. And with Lauren being unable to vote on the revote, it makes it so that his side loses out there. Now, yes, he isn't going to be the boot himself, but still, he would have been in the minority had they ever gone back to tribal. You also have his visit to Sheeple Island, where he completely alienates Carolyn to bro down with Danny, which is completely ridiculous. And considering that he and Danny don't even work together that much in the post-merge, I feel like that's another display of not good gameplay there. At the merge, he's obviously part of the team that wins the challenge, so he's given safety there. And while he technically doesn't vote out Josh at that tribal, he is part of the majority at that point. After that, his team does lose the challenge, however, he has individual immunity there, and with the Ratus having a clear majority, they stick together, they take out Matt. And then we get to his boot round, the first round of gameplay where he doesn't have some sort of immunity, where the Ratus think that they have the Tikas on their side. And while the Tikas technically vote with them, the Tikas knew that Danny was going to play his idol to idol Brandon out. And obviously Brandon gets taken out due to him being seen as the figurehead of the Ratus. So on the whole, it's a pretty tough game to assess, and I did consider putting him a little bit higher considering that he technically was idle out of the game. But considering the fact that he never survives around without immunity, the fact that he was technically in the minority later on in the pre-merge, the fact that he wasn't able to really lock up Danny when that could have been a number for him in the future, the fact that he needed an idol at that first tribal, and even then, I can't really pinpoint anything he did exceptionally well within the game. I can't really have Brandon too much higher than number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have another player that I just didn't really know what to do with, but considering that they got incredibly unlucky over the course of the game, I did decide to put them above Brandon. But here we have Matt from San Francisco, and obviously Matt got incredibly unlucky in the game, where at the first round he loses his vote for the first 2 tribals that he attends, and with the way that challenges play out, he's unable to vote until his boot round, which is the second round after the merge, which in itself is incredibly unlucky given that he and Jam Jam were at the bottom of a clear Ratu majority there. So he gets very unlucky over the course of the season, and that is partially a factor in why I do have him a bit higher in the list. Now, in terms of where he stood on his tribe, he obviously has a very close relationship with Franny, although I'm not entirely sure how strategic that is. Although, to be fair, Franny and Matt are certainly strategic in their own right, and it did seem like they had good relationships throughout the pre-merge. Now, I will kind of knock them for losing Claire right off the bat, although considering that the challenge strength played a factor, and considering that Matt obviously couldn't vote to potentially create this plan against Josh, I don't fault him too much for that. And considering that Josh seemed to be on his way out if they ever went back to Tribal, I actually don't think Matt was in that much danger until the swap, where at that point Jaime came on. They assumed that they would stay Ahsoka strong until Jaime obviously has an idol that they don't really know about. And while I do have to give Matt a bit of credit for knowing that Jaime might have an idol at that point, I also think that Matt could have been in more danger at that point, as we did see on the show that Jaime was like maybe considering targeting Matt, although they never go to tribal, so we can't say for sure. And then obviously at that merge, he is part of that Soka contingent that seemed to be pretty solid at that point until they obviously get to that split tribal the very next round, where he obviously gets screwed over here. And I think had Matt survived that round, I think he probably would have been in a good position moving forward, where we know that the Tikas were obviously playing the middle. Now, I guess you could debate whether the Tikas would have sided with the Sokas immediately, considering the Sokas would have had one extra number, or if they would have tried to play the middle by siding with the Ratus to take them out. So it's hard to say for sure where Matt was going, but I feel like he wouldn't have been the first target at that point. Whereas I feel like Danny would have been the bigger figure on the Soka side. And even between him and Franny, I think Franny could have been seen as a bigger threat compared to him. So I think Matt definitely would have slid on by for a bit longer in the game. And considering just how unlucky he got during the course of the season, that was a factor in me putting him a little bit higher. But considering that I don't have more information on his position during the pre-merge, I did decide to leave him here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and this person was pretty hard to place for obvious reasons, but we actually have the highest ranked pre-merge boot left to talk about. But here we have the other Matthew. And I think that Matthew played a pretty impressive game during the time that he was there, and a very creative player as well, willing to try out things that we haven't really seen before. Where during the first round, he uses his shot in the dark in order to hide his allegiance, which is a very creative use of it, even if it's a relatively short-term play. But then after that, he's able to essentially take the majority, despite Lauren and Brandon having 3 votes between the two of them, by him building this very close relationship with Kane, and he's able to even pull in Jaime after creating a fake idol, planting it for her to find, and then using that information to build a game relationship, which I find to be pretty impressive there. It makes it so that they would have the majority if they ever went back to tribal, where they could just easy stack their votes into Lauren, ensuring that she can't vote on the revote and use that extra vote there, and then just outright take the majority from that point on. And considering that he had a good relationship with Brandon during their time with the Sweat Challenge, I think Matthew was set up very well on that Ratu tribe, and I feel like going to the merge, Matthew could have easily maneuvered through that, where he would have had bigger targets in front of him, and I think he would have made a relatively deep run. Now, I do question whether he would have made it to the very end, as I feel like he could have easily fit into this mold of the Ulmers, the Shans, of eventually being taken out as this big threat, but I don't think he would have been the first target after the merge, even if the Ratus went down the numbers. Obviously, the problem is that he has to leave the game due to a shoulder injury, which I do think is a bit of a knock, considering that it was definitely one of the more preventable injuries in Survivor history. So I do have to knock him a bit for that. But at the end of the day, I still think Matthew played a very impressive game during the time that he was there. He was able to take the majority after the first round. He showed a willingness to play aggressively, and I felt like he would have been set up well in the post-merge. And I did consider putting him a little bit higher, but at the end of the day, I mean, he's still a pre-merge boot. He still only went to one tribal, and it's hard to say whether his strategy would have really panned out in the post-merge. So because of that, I do have to leave him here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and this player was a bit interesting to discuss as I feel like the edit made them come off a bit worse than what they actually were, but at the end of the day, I feel like this person probably had very little win equity had they gotten to the end. But here we have Jaime, who did get all the way to 6th place, and I think she gets dunked on a bit too much in the edit. However, at the end of the day, I still find her game a bit mediocre, if I'm being honest, where at that first round, she was being targeted at a point, which is a big factor in her using her shot in the dark, the first successful shot in the dark play in the show's history, but by the time of Tribal, she was no longer seen as the main target there, so I guess that's a pro, but even then, she came off as a bit paranoid, which isn't great there. But then after that, she is like sort of lured into the majority by Matthew and Kane after she finds the fake idol that Matthew had created and planted for her. And I know this is presented as a big negative that, oh, what an idiot Jaime is for thinking that this idol is real. But it does seem like a lot of people thought the idol really was real, even at the point where they left the game. So at the end of the day, I think that's more so a pro on Matthew's game, the fact that he was able to create such a convincing fake idol. But through that, Matthew is able to pull Jaime to the majority, where had Ratu gone by the tribal, she would have been in the numbers there, which is pretty good. She then gets swap screwed by being sent over to Sokka, but even then she gets an idol, or in her mind at least, 2 idols. And she is at the bottom for a lot of that. The Sokas were largely sticking strong there. However, even then, Danny, for whatever reason, thinks that Jaime doesn't have an idol, which is a bit dumb there, but she's able to scrape on through that. They never go to tribal. However, then at the merge, she's just kind of in the background for a lot of it, where she's like in the majority during a lot of those votes, but again, is never really in the driver's seat at any point. But then we get to the Brandon round where the Tikas do ultimately side with the Sokas and stick with them for the next few rounds, and she is in the bottom during that stretch where she does lose both Brandon and Kane back to back, until it's just her and Lauren, the perceived lesser threats of the Ratus. And while they do find themselves in the majority during the Franny and Danny rounds, a lot of that is because of the Tikas maneuvering more so than them really doing anything on their own. And really by the time Jaime goes home, she really doesn't have much of a shot of winning the game even if she gets to the end. But even then, the Tikas stick together to take her out the final 6. So at the end of the day, I find Jaime's game to be largely mediocre, where I feel like she didn't really have much agency throughout a lot of the game. But even so, she seemed to be pretty delusional about her game, where she felt like she was running the game and that she was the MVP, when in reality I felt like other players were controlling the game, and I feel like even if she gets to the end against Lauren, I feel like Lauren would win against her. So I feel like I can't really have Jaime too much higher because of that, even though she made it further than some of the people will be talking about soon, which is a big reason she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and I feel like this person was taken a bit more seriously than Jaime, but still has a number of issues with her game, but here we have Franny. And I feel like that was a major factor in putting her above Jaime, is that I feel like Franny was closer to winning the game compared to Jaime had she gone to the end. However, even so, I still have a number of issues with her game, where I feel like during the pre-merge, she was, again, in the majority for the most part. I do kind of falter for letting Claire go that early, considering that I feel like Claire was closer to her and Matt than she was to the Danny and Heidi side of things. But considering that Matt didn't have a vote, I don't really know what she could have done to really get around that. And considering that I think Josh would have been the next boot, I don't think she would have been in immediate danger per se. And while she gets through the earn the merge phase all right, we then get to the split tribal round, where I think she makes a bit of a questionable decision by choosing to win the challenge, even though she had already gotten individual immunity there, where obviously her closest ally Matt was on the other team and was very clearly in the minority at that point. And considering that she had already won individual immunity by being the last on her own team, when there were already several guys in the other team still left, I feel like she could have easily bowed out there, ensuring that Matt would be safe. And at that tribal, the Sokas would have had the majority in a spot where she already had immunity. So I feel like they could have easily stuck together and taken out probably Kane or Carolyn in that spot. But instead, she chooses to win the challenge, which obviously causes Matt to go out, but also kind of increases her own threat level by making her come off as a bit of a comp beast, which obviously plays a factor into her game later on. But then we get to the Brandon round where she technically gets saved by an idol, but as I explained earlier, the Tikas were actually working with the Sokas at that point, so really they had the numbers there anyway, so I don't fault her too much for that. However, she didn't have the best relationship with Danny either, and I feel like she largely gets benefited by tribal lines playing a big factor in that vote, where I feel like if they hadn't, I feel like Danny could have easily held on to his idol and let Franny go in that spot. So I don't think that's particularly great. But then after that, she wins immunity, and then the very next round, she wins the next reward challenge, which was completely unnecessary and really elevated her threat level to the point where she was pretty much the biggest target left on the board. And when she failed to win immunity, she was pretty much a goner at that point. However, I will also give her some credit for building that close relationship with Carolyn that made her so that she at least had one number on her side. But at the end of the day, I feel like Franny made a number of unforced errors, particularly in that post-merge, particularly surrounding her challenge wins, that made it so that her game was worse off because of it. Now, yes, she was technically in the majority for a lot of the game, and I feel like she would have had quite a bit of respect had she gone to the end. But I feel like with the errors that she made and her unnecessarily raising her threat level, I feel like it made it so that it was pretty much impossible for her to get to the end unless she won out, which is why I have her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have a player that I was actually somewhat impressed by, even though they were an earlier boot than Franny, but here we have Kane. And I actually think Kane played an alright game, all things considered. Now, there were just some rocky points, like early on, he was technically one of the votes for Brandon, which causes Brandon to want to target him in the future. That's not great. However, he does build a very close relationship with Matthew, which wasn't on the show, but was a big factor in him being in the majority, especially after they're able to pick up Jaime through Matthew's fake idol. And then after the swap, he's able to build a very close bond with Carson that allows them to, again, assume the majority. So I feel like Kane was actually in a very solid position, where even though he technically was going to be targeted by the other side to where at worst it would be a tie, I feel like with them having those 3 votes, if they put their votes in the Lauren, I think they would have gone through that round all right. And I also think he gets a bit unlucky that Matthew isn't allowed to go back to camp to say goodbye when he leaves the game, as Matthew said that had he gotten the chance to do so, he would have handed his idol over to Kane. So again, that's largely unlucky on his end. Things get a bit more interesting at the merge, where he is seen as a potential backup target in case Josh has an idol. However, even then, he's able to steer the votes away towards Yam Yam, so that's good on him there. After that, he is immune during the split tribal, although he comes out in a beneficial position after the Ratus get the 1-up in taking out Matt. But then after that, he's put at the bottom after the Tikas flip against the Ratus to work with the Sokas. However, even then, he's not the first target, which I do find a bit impressive, considering the fact that Danny had a closer personal relationship with Brandon. They decided to take the shot against Brandon first, idling him out, even though I think Kane probably wouldn't have been a bigger long-term threat compared to Brandon. Although the very next round he is taken out, and there really wasn't much he could do in that spot other than win immunity, I guess, but even then he does give up his chance to compete in order to get the rice. So at the end of the day, I still think Kane played an all-around solid game considering his circumstances, where even though there were points where he was being targeted, I feel like there were a few points where he was going to go home until the Ratus got flipped on after the merge, and I think he would have been a solid winner had he gone to the end, where the jury has talked about after the fact that they do respect Kane, where we saw a lot of them say that Kane played the best game of the jurors. So I think Kane was still well respected out there, and I think he was playing a solid game, but obviously he gets taken out at the final 9, which is why I do have to leave him here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and I feel like these next few were relatively close, where even though they made deep runs, I do have issues with all 3 of their gains. But at number 6, we actually have the last remaining Ratu member, but here we have Lauren. And Lauren is a bit of a tough game to assess, where she does get all the way to the final 5. However, I'm not entirely sure whether she wins if she gets to the end, where on my jury scenarios video, I said that she probably doesn't have too many locked up votes. However, we have her from the likes of Jaime and the players in the game that she was at least seen as a big threat. So for all we know, she could have won had she gotten to the end. And I think that was the biggest question mark with putting her this high. Whereas I feel like if she does win the game, I probably would have had her a little bit higher. But as it is a question mark. But if we are looking at the rest of her game, I mean, she's not that well positioned for a lot of it, where early on she does does build a very good relationship with Brandon, although even then, like, she almost loses Brandon at the first tribal, and she doesn't vote there, which I think was probably the best play considering that she needed to get the extra vote. But through Brandon surviving and her getting that extra vote, that made it so that they would have controlled at least half of the votes there, 3 of 6. However, the problem there is that they weren't able to lock up Jaime, and through that, it made it so that if there was a tie between her and Kane, for instance, that she would have lost that tiebreaker since she wouldn't be able to use her extra vote or any other votes on the revote. So I actually think Lauren was in quite a bit of danger if they ever went back to tribal, but they don't, so whatever. At the merge, she's just kind of there, like she is voting with the majority early on, but not really in the driver's seat. Same thing with the split tribal, where she is voting there. However, even then, Heidi controls her vote, mainly due to the threat of her having her extra vote, but even then, they're still able to win the day. But then after that, the Rogers get flipped on, and for the next few rounds, she's at the bottom. She loses Brandon, her closest ally. After that, she loses Kane, but even at that tribal, she gives her extra vote to Jaime, who then uses it to try and take out Heidi, but obviously that plan doesn't go through. And really, it's Lauren and Jaime being kept around because they're the smallest threats. And I feel like while that's good in terms of longevity, I feel like it also calls into question whether she would have won the game. But then after that, the Tikas do flip to work with the Ratus to take out a lot of the big threats on the Sokas, with Franny going at 8 and Danny going at 7. But again, I feel like it's mainly the Tikas driving this more so than Lauren herself. But then at the final 6, we see the Tikas start to contemplate turning against each other. And she even does try to get them to flip against Carolyn, but it's largely unsuccessful and they do lose Jaime there. And I do think that's kind of bad, the fact that she's unable to get the Tikas to flip against each other, even though they're recognizing that they're all big threats against each other. But we're at a spot in the final 5 where Lauren has to win out in order to get to the end, and when she fails to win immunity, she's taken out in a 3-1-1 vote, where she once again is unsuccessful in leading a flip against the Tikas, where she does try to flip against Yam Yam, but isn't even able to get Heidi on her side for that vote. So on the whole, like, not great there. So I feel like Lauren doesn't really have much agency throughout the game, where she's in a lot of danger to go home in the pre-merge if they ever went back to tribal. And even at the post-merge, I can't really pinpoint a point where she has much agency, where she's at the bottom at multiple points, and even at points where she tries to flip the game against the Tika, she's unsuccessful in doing so. And I still think her win equity is a bit questionable. Now again, I wouldn't be surprised if it came out that Lauren was like this big jury threat that could have pitched her game as an underdog if she got into the end. However, I'm not entirely sure where those locked votes would come from based on my jury scenarios video. So I think that still is a question mark that leaves her a bit lower on the list. Although if it does come out that she would have won, I probably would have her like a spot or 2 higher. But as it is, with the information that I have at the time of recording, I feel like 6 is about as high as I can put her. Now we're moving on to number 5, and I really struggle with these next 2, as I feel like these players both have pretty flawed games, and one was clearly more dominant than the other. However, I did decide to pick the person with longevity over the more dominant force. So at number 5, I do have Danny. And I think Danny was one of the more dominant players on the season in terms of control. I feel like he completely controlled his Soka tribe during the pre-merge. I feel like he was a pretty central force in taking out Claire during that one trouble that they went to. And even beyond that, like, he did find the idol from the birdcage and was also able to manipulate Matt into thinking that the fake idol was the real idol. So I think all that is pretty impressive. However, even during the pre-merge, I think he has some pretty questionable logic. Like when Jaime comes over to their tribe after the swap, he's so convinced that she doesn't have an idol, like even after searching through her bag, which I think is pretty dumb there. You also have his visit to Shipwheel Island where he's broing down with Brandon, all while making Carolyn feel like she's on the outs there, so that's not particularly great. But even so, he still controls his pre-merge tribe, and even moving forward is the leader of the Soka contingent, and they're able to control a lot of those early votes, where they're able to lead the charge against Josh at that first round. After that, I mean, he is pretty powerless, considering he is immune during the split tribal, and while they do lose Matt, that's not the biggest loss in the world there, but he's still like the leader of the Soka group. But then we get to the Brandon round, where I think his gameplay starts to become a bit more questionable, where he does decide that he's going to take a shot against the Ratus, which I don't think is the wrong move at that point, considering how much tribal lines matter during this phase of the game. However, the way that he does it is pretty questionable, where rather than simply getting the Tikas to vote with them to ensure that they had the majority, he allows the Tikas to vote with the Ratus in voting for Franny, and then he's going to use his idol to save Franny, which I think is a bit more questionable, considering the fact that he doesn't have that good of a relationship with Franny. The fact that he's using his idol at this point to save someone he doesn't have that great of a relationship with is pretty questionable in my view. And plus, he's using it to target Brandon, which I kind of get in the sense that Brandon is the clear leader of the Ratus. However, Brandon was also someone that he had a good personal relationship with. And I feel like Kane would have been a much more suitable target in that spot, as keeping Brandon around would be ensuring that he has someone that he has a good relationship with, and also keeping around a shield, as Brandon could be viewed as the leader of the opposite side. So I feel like by using it, he's pretty much giving up his idol in order to keep someone around that probably isn't going to benefit his game in the long term, taking out someone that would have benefited his game. And also, he allows the Tikas to get away with broadening the middle by throwing their votes with the Ratus, which I think is a bit dumb there. And he doesn't really punish them either for that in the future, where even in the next round, where Franny is literally telling Danny that the Tikas are playing the middle and that they should keep an eye out for them. Like, Danny just sort of dismisses that, which is a bit dumb there, and continues with this Ratu war with the Tikas voting with them, which again is fine. But then the next round, he goes along with the Tika and Ratu's plan to take out Franny, which again calls into question why he used his idol there to begin with. Like, I feel like it's just him using his idol for seemingly no long-term benefit. And then the round after that is where he's taken out in his split vote plan, but still, by that point, he was clearly the biggest target left on the board. He was the very clear leader of the Soka group, and he is taken out in a split vote. So on the whole, I think Danny's someone that definitely had more control than a lot of the players we already talked about, which is a major reason that he is as high as he is. However, even within that control, I question a number of his decisions, like him thinking that Jaime couldn't have an idol during the post swap, him alienating Carolyn during his visit to Shipwheel Island, him using his idol to save Franny when he didn't really trust Franny and was going to vote her out a couple rounds later anyway, him idling out Brandon when Brandon could have been a number for him in the future and a shield to hide his threat level, and obviously him being unwilling to take a shot against the Tikas until it was too late. So I feel like Danny really struggled with threat management, and I think he made a number of questionable decisions with his control. But the fact that he had that control to begin with, and plus I think he would have been a somewhat likely winner had he gotten to the end, was enough to have him this high on the list. But at the end of the day, I still feel like his questionable decisions and his relatively early boot is why he is here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and as I alluded to earlier, this is the person that had more longevity than Danny, but here we have Heidi, the second place finisher from the season. And Heidi's another tough game to assess because on one hand, she was in the majority for a lot of the game, and I guess you could say there were points where she had agency, particularly towards the very end. However, I feel like her middle merge was incredibly messy, and even before that, I felt like she was largely playing behind Danny to where she didn't have too much agency. Now again, early on, she was sort of seen on the show as a swing vote during the Clara vote, but even then it was pretty clear she was voting to take out Claire in that spot, and even moving forward to the merge, she is, again, in the majority. She is like voting with these Sokas. However, even then, she doesn't have too much agency there. During the split tribal, she comes across the control vote advantage, and while she technically is unable to save Matt, there really wasn't much she could do considering that obviously Lauren had her extra vote, and had she not picked Lauren in that spot, Lauren could have easily used her extra vote to further ensure that Matt goes home. So she at least made the vote closer than what it could have been, even though there really wasn't much she could do to actually save Matt there. After that, she is in the majority for the next few rounds, taking out Brandon and Kane. However, despite her being pretty under the radar, she is still being seen as a bit of a target, where she is getting votes during the Kane round, where the plan was to split the vote onto Danny and Heidi. She does get 3 votes there, even though I feel like Danny is probably the bigger target on the board in that case. After that, you have the Franny tribal, where there was an attempt to flip against her. We do see Carolyn and Franny attempt to blindside Heidi by getting the Tikas on board, and while they weren't really on board, that's not really a great spot for her to be in. And even then, she throws her vote onto Danny, which kind of comes out of left field and doesn't really do much to help her game. And yes, while Danny did say afterwards that he didn't even suspect Heidi voted for him, I still don't really see the value in doing so. And then after that, she is, again, on the bottom. She loses Danny, and got votes herself in case an idol was played, so that's a bit of a hairy spot. And then after that, the final 6, she does join the Tikas in voting out Jaime, who I think was probably her easiest beat at this point. And she does say at that point that her final 3 is to get to the end with Carolyn and Yam Yam, which is probably not the ideal final 3 for her to be in, as she does lose to both of them, I feel like. I feel like she probably would have been better off trying to get to the end against Jaime and Lauren, where yes, you could say that the Ratus could have sided with one of them, as one of them could have been seen as an underdog, but I feel like going up against like 2 Tika members was also not that ideal. So there's that. And she also plays her idol at this tribal, which doesn't really do much to help her game, especially when she could have used it potentially to save Lauren at the next tribal, but whatever. After that, she does join in on the plan to vote out Lauren, which isn't great, and she even gets a vote from Yam Yam in case an idol was played, so that's not great. And really at the final 4, like, we do see her put herself into fire to take on Carson, which I think was probably one of the better moves she could have made in that spot, as I do think it's a risky move and it does pay off. It's something that she can tell the jury. But really, by that point, her fate was pretty much sealed. She was losing the game no matter what. And while I do respect her for putting herself into fire, I feel like she could have done more things from earlier on to ensure that she could be in a spot to win the game. I think similar to Danny, I think she makes her move a bit too late in flipping against the Tikas and really put herself in a spot to where she was at the final 6 with all 3 of the Tikas still in the game, and even at the final 5 with all 3 Tikas still in the game. So I feel like that was a bit of a risky spot for her to potentially win the game. And even her final tribal performance was pretty mediocre, where I feel like she wasn't really able to claim much to her game other than putting herself in the fire. And while she does pick up Danny's vote, I feel like that was just never going to be enough. I feel like that was the only vote she really had any shot at getting, even going into final tribal. So at the end of the day, I feel like Heidi's game is kind of mediocre in terms of a runner-up game. I feel like there were many points where she was just sort of the second in command to Danny. I feel like there were points in the post-merge where she was making some pretty questionable decisions. There were points in the post-merge where she was being targeted when I felt like she wasn't the biggest target on the board. And I feel like her allowing the Tikas to get as deep into the game as they were was pretty detrimental to her chances of winning the game, even though I feel like there were cases where she could have done more to ensure that she gets to the end in a winning position. But at the end of the day, I still feel like she made it deeper into the game than Danny. I feel like she, in general, had better threat management compared to Danny. And I think her move of making fire at the end was enough to have her above Danny. But at the end of the day, I feel like there's a pretty clear top 3, which is why she's here number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and obviously it is the Tika 3. I feel like there's a pretty clear gap between numbers 4 and 3. And if I'm being honest, there is a gap between 3 and 2 and 1. But at number 3, we do have Carolyn. And I think Carolyn played a solid game once she found her footing. However, I feel like there were a number of points where she was just completely out of the loop compared to even what Carson and Yam Yam were doing. Where early on, she's obviously at the bottom, she struggles to fit in socially, and she was targeted at that first tribal that they went to, where we obviously saw Helen and Sarah be pretty intent on targeting them, and there was a chance that Carson could have joined in on that to make Carolyn the first boot. However, she does get kind of lucky that, one, Sarah lost her vote during their visit to Chippewa Island, and also the fact that Carson thinks that Helen has an idol, which I actually think might be a pro considering that Carolyn obviously finds the real idol, and she's able to come off as someone that would wear her heart on her sleeve and couldn't give away the fact that she has an idol if she had one. So I think that's somewhat good gameplay, but I also think she gets a bit lucky. And then moving forward, she's in the majority with her, Carson, and Yam Yam up until the swap where Carson gets sent over, and we see Josh come in there with an idol, and then through that, Josh approaches Carolyn by flipping against Sarah. And I do think Carolyn makes the correct decision in flipping against Sarah, as it makes it so that if they ever went back to tribal, that it would make her the swing vote between Josh and Yam Yam. Now, realistically, we see afterwards Josh kind of outplay her by going to Yam Yam and feeding off their conflict to where Josh now becomes a swing vote. And there's a chance that Josh and Yam Yam could have teamed up to take out Carolyn at the next tribal, but by the time they go back to tribal, we do see her reconcile with Yam Yam to where Josh would have been the next boot. So even then, that's not the worst thing in the world. And plus, she had an idol herself, so she probably would have been safe there anyway. But then we get to the merge, where I think the merge run is a bit wonky, where she does team up with Carson and Yam Yam to be the Tika 3 moving forward. However, she's still taking the least seriously of those 3, where she literally tells multiple people that Josh's idol is fake. However, they just don't believe her. Like, they still think that they need to split the vote, even though she knows for sure that the idol is fake. And even Yam Yam knows the idol is fake, but they still agree to go along with the split vote. And she is left out of the split vote plan, where she is the one person to vote for Kane. That's not particularly great. After that, she is immune during the split tribal, so not too much to say there. But then we get to the Brandon round, where she does technically vote correctly in voting out Brandon. However, Carson and Yam Yam were actively playing the middle by throwing their votes onto Franny, knowing that Danny was going to play his idol in that spot, and through that placate the other Ratus into thinking that they're working with them. Carolyn is completely left out of that scheme, which isn't great, and while she is roped back in for the Kane round, we get to the final 8 where she's completely blindsided, where she loses Franny, someone she was very close with, because of how big of a threat Franny was and how close the two of them seemed to be, and probably that should have been a point where she should have try to consider flipping against Carson and Yam Yam, and we even see her acting very upset. But then after a little bit, she's able to come back around and work with them again, to where at the final 7, she does use her idol to save Carson here. Now, technically, she doesn't save Carson because Danny got the most votes there. However, that's still a move that she could potentially put on her resume. But even then, we get to the final 6, where we see Carson and Yam Yam start to feel threatened by Carolyn, where they think that Carolyn will spin the idol play into her winning a jury vote. And we see them even consider flipping against her at that point. And the fact that Carolyn is being seen as the biggest threat between them really says a lot. And the fact that Jaime and Lauren are willing to flip against Carolyn over the likes of Carson and Yam Yam, I think speaks more to Carolyn's lack of threat management in comparison to Carson and Yam Yam. But since Carson and Yam Yam are still wanting to keep her around, she's able to stay there. And then from the final 5 on, like, she's able to stick with them. She votes out Lauren at the final 5, even though Yam Yam at that point was seen as the bigger threat. And at the final 4, we see Heidi choose to take her to the end, where she does ultimately lose here, being a 0 vote finalist. And I think a lot of that stems from her coming off as an emotional player and not being taken super seriously, where you could clearly tell she was taking lessons from the likes of Marianne and Erica, both of whom really played into their perceptions in order to skate on through the game until they were able to make their big moves and win the game because of that. However, I feel like on this season, where Yam Yam and Carson were playing very similar games to her and were actively outplaying her at multiple points, I felt like it led to Carolyn just simply not being taken as seriously, especially when there were clear alternatives to that type of gameplay style of rewarding a Tika at the end. So I do give her a bit of credit for playing into those perceptions, but I felt like it led to her still not being taken seriously by the end. But at the end of the day, I still feel like she played a much more solid game than really anyone outside of the Tika 3, but I feel like there were still more points where she's being outplayed by the other Tika 3 members, to where she's clearly here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and obviously the top 2 are pretty definitive, it's just a matter of ordering them, and I feel like both these players play pretty solid games, with the main separator being that one of them won the game. But at number 2, we do have Carson. And again, I think Carson largely defied my expectations here, where I didn't doubt that he would play hard. However, I definitely underestimated how well he would integrate socially, where he was very well positioned for a lot of the game and was in less danger throughout a lot of the pre-merge and most of the post-merge compared to Yam Yam. However, I still think Yam Yam probably outplayed him by the very end of it. But if we are looking at his game early on, he is very well positioned. He is pretty much in the middle of the Tika tribe, where he has Carolyn and Yam Yam on one side and Helen and Sarah on the other side. And he does ultimately vote out Helen here, probably due to a misconception that thinking that Helen had the idol, which is probably a knock against this game. However, considering that Sarah didn't vote, I mean, it would have resulted in a tie even if he voted with Helen at that tribal. But through that, he's able to maintain his strong position. At the swap, he goes over to Ratu, where he builds very good bonds with a lot of the members there and aligns himself with Matthew and Kane, to where had they gone the tribal, they would have had the numbers there. At the merge is where he really starts to take control of the game, where he obviously builds the Tika 3 alongside Yam Yam and Carolyn. However, even then, it's really him and Yam Yam that are the brains of the operation, where they're able to run the game moving forward. They take out Josh at the merge. At the Brandon round, they're able to play the middle by throwing their votes onto Franny, even knowing that Danny was going to play his idol, so they're able to still get their way in working with the Sokas while still placating the Ratus, which could have gotten them exposed. However, they never really get punished for that, which I think is pretty impressive there. After that, they're able to again pick off the Ratus by taking out Kane in that spot. After that, they're able to flip against Franny, who was not only a big challenge threat, but also someone that could have peeled Carolyn away over time, so they're able to break that up. And they're able to even pull in Carolyn back in after Carolyn is initially a setup. Then that results in them continuing to play the middle by taking out Danny at final 7, though even then he does have his first danger spot where Danny and Heidi wanted to take him out. However, even then they're able to get Jaime and Lauren on board to split the vote between Danny and Heidi, but even outside of that, Carolyn plays her idol on him, which is pretty good there. At the final 6, he's able to keep Yam Yam from flipping against Carolyn in a spot where that could have happened, and through that they're able to take out Jaime and ensure that the Tikas have a majority at the final 5. Now he does win immunity at the final 5, which ensures that Lauren can be taken out, someone that could have been a threat for them at the end game. However, as I said earlier, I don't know if that's a guarantee. And at the final 4, we see him pretty much be the biggest threat left on the board, where Heidi gives up immunity to take him on in fire, and obviously she ends up beating him in record time. So on the whole, it's a pretty impressive game. I actually think for most of the game, Carson's threat level was lower than that of Yam Yam's, where Yam Yam obviously had plenty of points where he was in danger, albeit through outside circumstances, but still, like, Carson was able to manage his threat level pretty well, all things considered, despite him being like one of the main figures running the game. However, I think by the end, I think Yam Yam is able to outmaneuver him in ensuring that Heidi would be able to take him to the end over him, and with him losing in fire, he obviously comes up short. So I still think Carson played a very impressive game and probably dominated the game alongside Yam Yam, and had he gone to the end, I think he would have had a serious shot of winning the game. However, at the end of the day, I still think Yam Yam outplayed him by the end, which is why he is here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe played the best game on Survivor 44 is the winner of the season, and here we have Yam Yam. Now, I do think there were points in the game where Carson was better positioned than Yam Yam, and I think there are points where Carson got his way over Yam Yam, but I still think by the end, Yam Yam was better positioned to get to the end and to win it at the end. Now, if we are looking at this game though, it is still a very impressive game. We're early on, like, he's obviously aligning with Carolyn. Mind you, I think Carson is more actively playing the middle there, and while he does get a bit lucky that Sarah doesn't vote, he is able to get Carson to vote with them in that round to take out Helen, and through that they're able to become the majority. After that, he does get a bit unlucky with the swap where Josh comes over and is able to flip Carolyn against him, and while you do have to fault Yam Yam a bit for making Carolyn feel that he wasn't respecting her, it's still like largely a result of Josh having an idol that incentivizes Carolyn to flip, as otherwise I feel like Carolyn probably would have stuck it out and voted out Josh in that spot, but instead Yam Yam loses Sarah, and there was a point where it could have been in danger with Carolyn seeming to be the swing vote coming into that next tribal. However, we see Josh then go to Yam Yam and agree to work with him, and I think that's pretty interesting on Yam Yam's end, that he basically makes it so that he's no longer like the main target. Although considering that Carolyn had an idol, it definitely would have been a bit wonky, assuming that he tried to vote out Carolyn in that spot. But even then, like, he's able to repair things with Carolyn to ensure that Josh would have been the next boot by the time of that next tribal. But then we get to the merge where I think he plays that not ideally, where we do see him like knowing that Josh has a fake idol. However, he still agrees to go along with splitting the vote onto Josh and Kane. However, we do see Kane kind of outplay him by getting like the likes of Brandon and Josh to flip over their votes to Yam Yam as a sort of a backup option in case Josh really did have an idol. But considering he didn't, he's able to get through that round fine. But then after that, we get to the split tribal where he gets very unlucky with that split, where it's basically him and Matt on the bottom with the Asratu majority that was very incentivized to stick together. Now, I do have to give Yam Yam a lot of credit here for outplaying Matt and getting the Ratus to want to keep him around. Mind you, I think it made sense for the Ratus to vote out Matt anyway, considering the Sokas were a bigger threat moving forward compared to the Tikas, and I think some of that is attributed to Yam Yam playing into this perception that the Tikas were scattered at that point. So it is partially good gameplay on his end, but I think it's also a factor of the Ratus just doing what was in their best interest, but he's able to scrape on through that. And then from that point on, Jaime and Carson essentially dominate the game together, where from that point on, they're able to play the middle. They're able to placate the Ratus by voting with them during the round where Brandon goes home, knowing that Danny has his idol play. After that, they're able to pick off the Ratus again by taking out Kane. At the final 8, they're able to flip against Franny, taking her out and ensuring that Carolyn wouldn't have a closer ally in Franny moving forward. And at the final 7, we do see Carson being the target over Jaime in that spot, but even then they're able to pull in Jaime and Lauren to ensure that Danny would be the vote, with Heidi as the backup target in case an idol was played. And I think throughout this entire phase, it's largely Carson and Jaime working together to play the middle and dominate the game. While you could say Carson was better positioned than Jaime, I think Jaime was still very much involved in these discussions, so I think to a degree they can be considered as co-dominant. However, then we get to the final 6, where I do think Carson does get his way over Jaime, where we do see Jaime seriously consider targeting Carolyn here. Now, I'm not entirely sure how committed he was to this. However, from the show at least, we see that Jaime wanted to target Carolyn, while Carson wanted to keep them around a bit longer to ensure that they would at least have the majority. And yes, while Jaime ultimately votes out Jaime here in a spot where it benefits him, I still think Carson is probably the cooler head in that situation. But then at the final 5, we do see Carson win immunity, which is a bit unlucky on Jaime's end. It basically makes it that Lauren votes for Jaime and tries to get the others to flip against him, and that is unsuccessful. We do see Heidi stick by him, mainly due to Heidi wanting to take him and Carolyn to the end. And by the final 4, Jaime is pretty much guaranteed to get to the end, unless Carson won a final immunity, where in that spot, Heidi wanted to take Carolyn and Jaime to the end, and I think even Carolyn would have recognized that Carson was a bigger threat at that point compared to Jaime, so I think through that, we can definitely see Jaime being better positioned in the end game compared to Carson. But really, I still think Jaime played a very impressive game. While I probably would have voted for Carson over Jaime had they both gotten to the end together, I still think they both share a lot of credit for their dominance of the game in the post-merge, and at the end of the day, I think Jaime is a very satisfying winner. Now yes, there were more points earlier on where Jaime was in danger compared to Carson, particularly during that split tribal, where I don't really fault him much for that at all. And even the Sarah round, like while it wasn't great the way he handled that to where Carolyn felt alienated, I felt like that wouldn't have mattered as much had Josh not come in there with an idol. So even then, I think Jaime got unlucky at points, but he still managed to push through with his social game. He was able to dominate the game strategically alongside Carson and Carolyn in the post-merge, and in the end, he was clearly a jury favorite. So I think for all those reasons, I think Jaime is the best player of the season, which is why he is here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now I will be wrapping up my coverage with a review of the season, so stay tuned for that. After that, I'm going to be doing some general Survivor content in the lead up to Big Brother 25, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which you can join by clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that's the video. See ya.